And the reporting on the U.S. military attack preparation and the president's tweet in response leave the world a bit breathless tonight. I want to speak first with Iran analyst Behnam Bentaloglu. He is with the Foundation of Defense of Democracy, a think tank in Washington. He is joining us, however, from Singapore, where he is currently. A very good evening, sir. Is this a needless crisis?
Good evening to you. It could be seen as a needless crisis, but why is it needless? I think it's important to have the facts in proper place here. It's needless because Iran has engaged in a marked escalation that is actually quite different from the way Iran prosecutes its foreign policy and national security strategy. Iran is an asymmetrically strong country, but conventionally weak country when it comes to military power. So Iran tends not to engage in direct confrontations. Iran's decision, however, to fire directly from its territory using a surface-to-air missile against an American drone shows that there may be a change going on in Iran's national security thinking about red lines, about American escalation, and about how far they can push. And if this change is sustained over time, that would mean that Iran would become more bold in the region. And that itself would be needless, given the tensions in the region already and given the 40 years of enmity between the U.S. and Iran.
But that begs, of course, the question is, what is the incentive for Iran? I mean, it's being backed against the wall, because from Tehran's national security perspective, they would have to respond to any perceived U.S. military intervention.
Well, from Tehran's national security perspective, they would have to respond to perceived military intervention, but a drone which is largely engaged in reconnaissance should not count as that. And historically, I think drones have monitored Iran's territory, be it for its nuclear program, missile program, or other malign activities that Americans and other allied forces want to keep eyes on, albeit from a distance. There are, of course, a few times in Iranian history in the 40 years of the Islamic Republic when Iran has backed down. And if you look at that history, it actually has backed down when it was presented with the alternative of no way out but through, or as you mentioned, when the back is to the wall. The way Iran ended the 1980 to 1988 Iran-Iraq War, when it was extended needlessly for 6 years, is an example. For the first 7 years of that war, the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini, said war until victory. And at the end, he said he drinks from a poison chalice and likened accepting a UN ceasefire resolution to drinking from a poison chalice. So I think the conditions here matter. And Washington should be trying to put Tehran's back to the wall and then offer it a clear path away.
But by all accounts, and by the looks of it, Iran is not about to capitulate. So I'm just wondering, what does success look like from your perspective and that of the U.S.?
That's an excellent question, because by all accounts, I think Iran is going to be escalating further, and not just in the area that you mentioned, which is, pushing back on America in a military sense. In the Persian Gulf, I think we can expect to see more of what we saw in May. In countries where Iranian proxies are active, such as Iraq and Syria, I would expect them to be wanting to target U.S. forces or U.S. assets or U.S. interests. In the cyber domain, I would expect Iran to be quite active. In the missile testing world as well as Iran's nuclear program. President Rouhani of Iran laid out 2 timetables to grow Iran's nuclear program throughout this summer, willingly saying that Iran would transgress the limits imposed on it by the JCPOA nuclear deal. But in my view, this is Iran building up leverage. Iran saying that it too has its own escalation options, and it's trying to use all of this different escalation to intimidate Washington, to make sure that there is a split in the transatlantic community as opposed to unity, and force Washington to more publicly say that it wants a deal, weaken the sanctions that exist, and drive Washington to the negotiating table, as opposed to Washington driving Tehran to the negotiating table. It's a high-risk strategy by Tehran.
It is a high-risk strategy, because what happens if Mr. Trump cannot get a bigger, better agreement? Because in the end, what has pulling out of this nuclear deal achieved? The deal with Iran, which, according to the IAEA, was complying with fully.
Well, that's also an important point, because when the U.S. left the deal last May, the reason given for leaving the deal was not related to compliance. The reason is, according to the U.S., that what America traded away, its sanctions leverage, was far greater in value as to what Iran gave up, which was limited, time-sensitive concessions about the nuclear issue only. So by Washington restoring the sanctions that the JCPOA once waived, it's trying to create the same conditions that got Iran to the negotiating table, but once Iran gets there, to broaden the aperture and have a bigger discussion. Now, I think Iran is actually, in the very short term, winning the battle here because it's trying to paint the administration in Washington as rhetorically tough, but when it comes to action, weak. And so Iran is trying to solidify a narrative that America cannot, in fact, to borrow from the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Khomeini, it cannot do a damn thing, quote unquote. And this is, in fact, a pretty dangerous narrative to want to stick onto the administration, because the administration could be incentivized to escalate in response to Tehran to prove that narrative wrong. So I think what has happened is Washington has generated tough penalties. The value is that Washington has done in 9 months what took multilateral sanctions 6 years to do when you look at the Iranian economy. And the goal, of course, is to make Tehran realize that there is no way out but through, and it is a bigger, broader, better deal that is in Iran's own interest.
Iran analyst Behnam Bentaloglu with the Foundation of Defense of Democracy. Sir, thank you for weighing in.
Thank you so much.